young doctor walks into a hospital room and addresses the patient lying in bed. "Mr. Reynolds, I have your test results. You have exactly 6 months to live. Your heart is failing, and you're too far down the transplant list to receive one in time. If there's anything we can do to make your remaining time comfortable, please let us know." But the patient doesn't cry. He doesn't beg. He just smiles faintly and says, "My last request? I want to find the family of the man I killed 15 years ago and ask for their forgiveness." The doctor's expression hardens. "That's not something the hospital can facilitate. We're here to provide medical care, not personal redemption." But the patient looks her straight in the eye and says something unexpected. "Then help me find them yourself. You have the resources, and I know you're his daughter." The doctor freezes, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. Her voice barely controlled, she says, "I took an oath to help patients, not to grant absolution to my father's murderer." Yet the patient's request never changes. So the question is, did the doctor eventually help this dying man find redemption? What happened next is a story that will leave you speechless. This is based on a true incident. Watch till the end, and if you enjoy this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story like this again. The antiseptic smell of the hospital couldn't mask the staleness of room 307. Morning light filtered through half-drawn blinds, casting uneven stripes across the bed where Marcus Reynolds lay. At 48, his body had aged well beyond its years, skin sallow, cheekbones prominent, and eyes sunken from the combination of heart failure and the weight of past sins. Despite his deteriorating condition, there was a quiet dignity in the way Marcus carried himself. He never complained to the nurses, always said please and thank you, and kept a dog-eared book of poetry on his nightstand. For someone with death hovering so close, he seemed strangely at peace. Dr. Elena Winters moved differently through the hospital corridors than her colleagues. Where others rushed, she walked with deliberate steps. Where others spoke loudly over patients, she listened intently. At 31, she was one of the youngest cardiologists on staff, brilliant and meticulous, but with an emotional distance that patients and colleagues alike had come to accept. Few knew the trauma that had shaped her life: a father murdered during a robbery when she was just 16, a mother who collapsed under grief's weight, and a young Elena who channeled all her pain into becoming the doctor her father had always wanted her to be. Medicine became her refuge, her purpose, her vengeance against the unfairness of death. The hospital was her domain, a place where she wielded control over the chaos of life and death. Until Marcus Reynolds was admitted, and suddenly the careful walls she had built began to crack. The tension in room 307 was palpable the day after their first confrontation. Elena had almost assigned another doctor to Marcus's case, but something, professional integrity or morbid curiosity, kept her from doing so. "How did you know who I am?" she asked, standing at the foot of his bed, keeping the maximum distance possible while still being in the same room. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted himself to sit upright. "Your father had your photo in his wallet. He showed it to me right before I—" His voice trailed off. "You have his eyes." Elena's jaw tightened. "You had no right to look at that photo. You had no right to take his life." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I've known that every day for 15 years. Then why ask for this now? Why not just die with your guilt?" Her clinical tone couldn't mask the bitterness beneath. Marcus looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "Because I want to die as something more than just the worst thing I've ever done." He turned back to her. "And because your father asked me to." Elena's clipboard clattered to the floor. "What did you just say?" "After I shot him while we waited for the ambulance I called, your father looked at me and said, 'Someday tell my family I forgive you.'" Marcus's voice cracked. "I never did. I went to prison, served my time, but I never had the courage to face what I'd done. Now I'm out of time." Elena retrieved her clipboard with shaking hands. "My father would never say that." "He had a small scar on his right thumb," Marcus said softly. From when he tried to carve a wooden horse for your 10th birthday. He carried a St. Christopher medal in his left shoe, and he hummed Moon River when he was nervous. Elena stood frozen. These were intimate details no one could know unless they'd spent those final moments with her father. Details she'd never seen in any police report. "Get some rest, Mr. Reynolds," she said abruptly, turning to leave. "Your cardiac function isn't improving, and we need to adjust your medication." As the door closed behind her, Elena leaned against the wall, her professional composure crumbling. How could she possibly help the man who destroyed her family? And yet, how could she ignore her father's final wish? The next few weeks passed in a strange dance of avoidance and reluctant connection. Elena continued as Marcus's doctor, maintaining professional distance during morning rounds. But sometimes, in the quieter evening hours when the hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm, she would find herself drawn back to room 307. Their conversations started clinically, his symptoms, medication adjustments, practical matters of his care. Gradually, they began to speak of other things. She learned that Marcus had been a carpenter before that night, that he'd fallen into addiction after his wife died, that the robbery was desperate and impulsive rather than calculated. "I was high," he admitted one evening, shame evident in his voice. "I didn't mean to pull the trigger. The gun was just supposed to scare him." "But you did pull it," Elena said, her voice tight. "And my mother never recovered. She died 3 years later, officially heart failure. But really, she died the same night my father did." Marcus closed his eyes, absorbing the pain of another life he'd taken, however indirectly. "I can't undo any of it, I know that." One night, Elena brought a small photo album to his room. "This was my father," she said, opening to a page showing a smiling man with kind eyes, her eyes, teaching a teenage Elena how to fish. "Dr. Thomas Winters. He worked in pediatric surgery. He saved children's lives." Marcus looked at the photo without touching it, as if he didn't deserve even that contact. He talked about his patience at the end, said he hoped someone would step in for the surgery he was supposed to perform the next day. Elena hadn't known this detail. "Someone did," she whispered. "His colleague completed the operation. The child lived." As April turned to May, Marcus's condition deteriorated further. His heart was failing more rapidly than anticipated. Elena found herself in the unusual position of fighting for more time for her father's killer, calling colleagues for experimental treatments, reviewing his case late into the night, pushing for options most doctors would have already abandoned. "Why are you trying so hard?" her colleague Dr. Patterson asked after Elena requested yet another consultation. "He's terminal. You know that better than anyone." Elena couldn't explain it, even to herself. Something unfinished pulled at her. Something beyond medicine. One rainy afternoon, she received an urgent page to room 307. Marcus was in acute distress, his oxygen levels plummeting. As the team stabilized him, Elena caught his frightened gaze across the chaotic room. For the first time, she saw not her father's murderer, but simply a dying man, terrified and alone. Later that night, after he'd been stabilized, she sat beside his bed while he slept. When he awoke and found her there, something had changed between them. "I need to know everything about that night," she said quietly. "Not just what was in the police reports. Everything you remember. I need to understand." And so, with labored breath and tears streaming down his hollow cheeks, Marcus told her the complete story of the night that had defined both their lives. 2 weeks later, Elna stood in the cemetery, the soft June breeze rustling through the oak trees that lined the paths. Behind her, a nurse waited with Marcus in a wheelchair, an oxygen tank at his side. He was much weaker now, each day a borrowed gift. Elena had spent days tracking down her mother's sister, her only living relative who had been present at her father's funeral. It had taken convincing, but Aunt Sarah had finally agreed to come. A silver car pulled up to the cemetery gates. An older woman stepped out, her gray hair cut in a short, practical style. She walked slowly toward them, stopping several feet away when she recognized who waited at the gravesite. "I can't believe you brought him here," Sarah said to Elena, anger and disbelief in her voice. "Dad would have wanted this," Elena replied with a certainty she couldn't explain. Marcus asked the nurse to wheel him forward. His hand shook as he produced a small wooden box from his lap. "I can never repair what I took from your family," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I've spent the last months of my life making this." He opened the box, revealing an intricately carved wooden horse, the very item Elena's father had been trying to make for her birthday all those years ago. "I found his unfinished design in an old newspaper article about the trial," Marcus explained. "I was a carpenter once. This was the only gift I could think to give." Aunt Sarah stepped forward, her face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Tom always said his hands were too clumsy for the delicate work. She looked at the perfect carving, then at Marcus. He would have appreciated the craftsmanship. Elena knelt by her father's grave, placing the wooden horse at the base of the headstone. "I think I understand now, Dad," she whispered. When she stood and turned back, Marcus was crying quietly. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me keep the promise I made to him, for letting me be more than just his killer before I die." Elena felt something shift inside her, not forgiveness exactly, but something equally powerful: understanding. The recognition that human beings are more complex than the worst choices they make. "My father believed in second chances," she said, looking between Marcus and her aunt. "He believed in healing, even when it seemed impossible." That afternoon, in the shadow of death that had connected them for 15 years, 3 broken people began the process of putting something back together. Not the lives that were lost, but something new from the fragments that remained. Resolution. Marcus Reynolds died on a Tuesday morning in late July, 3 months after his diagnosis. Elena was there holding his hand as he slipped away, not as her father's killer, but as her patient, as a human being who had found a measure of peace. His last words to her were simple: "Tell them all second chances aren't just for the forgiven, they're for those who forgive." The funeral was small, just Elena, Aunt Sarah, and a few nurses who had cared for Marcus. At Elena's request, he was buried near her parents, not out of some forced reconciliation, but as a symbol of the complex journey they had shared. In the months that followed, Elena established a program at the hospital, Second Chances, providing medical care and counseling for former inmates transitioning back to society. On her desk sat the wooden horse, a reminder of how healing comes in unexpected forms. Sometimes healing isn't about erasing the past but learning to carry it differently. Sometimes justice isn't found in punishment, but in transformation. And sometimes, the deepest wounds can only be mended by facing the very person who created them. Aunt Sarah eventually became a regular volunteer with the Second Chances program. "Your father would be proud," she told Elena one evening as they walked through the hospital corridor. "Not because you forgave the man who took him from us, but because you didn't let that moment define the rest of your life." Elena nodded, thinking of her father's last message, forgiveness offered to a stranger in his dying moments, and how that single act of grace had rippled outward through time, creating possibility where there had only been pain. "The hardest person to forgive was myself," Elena admitted. "For all those years of anger, for letting his death become my life." As they reached the hospital entrance, the sun was setting, casting long golden light across the parking lot. Elena thought about Marcus, about her father, about the strange journey that had brought her here. In the end, perhaps the greatest second chance wasn't the one she had given to Marcus Reynolds, but the one she had finally given to herself. If you guys want part 2 of this story, exploring Elena's journey with the Second Chances program and the unexpected connections she makes, let me know in the comments. A story of grief, redemption, and the complicated path to healing. Stories like this have the power to heal, to open eyes and to spark change, but only if they're heard. Don't let this moment end with you. Share it now, and if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe so you never miss a story that could change a life. Be the reason someone feels seen today.